Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review a movie called The Descent. So, here's the thing. I would say that I have kind of gone into a number of different other movie review people, and eventually I've kind of scrolled through, and eventually I would find this film eventually somewhere in their YouTube like videos, with the exclusion of some people here or there that probably just don't want to do horror movies or try to do like whatever tame ones or whichever. No offense to those people are cool. Those people are smart. Going into this movie, I would say that really, uh, there could be some people that probably did get really, really scared during this film. There's some people that probably got terrified and wet themselves and all kinds of things. I would say that there is a pretty decent amount of jump scares within this film. But really, to me, I took every jump scare like, here's the wind up and there's the pitch. Like, basically, I knew that they are spending way too much time in one location. So I immediately assumed, like, okay, the camera's on this one spot for a certain period of time. Wind up, and where is the thing that is just going to jump out and supposedly scare me? Oh, there it is. Like, immediately once I saw the very first real, true jump scare within this movie, I was like, oh, so we're playing it like this then. Ah, cheap. But, you're going to scare a lot of people. And I can understand why there's probably a lot of people that probably did enjoy this film just because of, like, man, this is like, man, this is like an adrenaline rush. Like, for me, like, it did nothing for me. Like, I was just like, okay, there was maybe like one moment out of like 10 that was actually like legitimately like, oh, okay, I can see where like this moment here is a scary moment because it wasn't actually a easily prepared thing. But altogether, like, I could just see where everything was heading. Like, I could see that, like, okay, especially after the very first jump scare. But anyways, I would say for the most point, the very beginning of this film and the very ending of this film are really honestly just like everything in between the cave parts where the women actually all go into this cave. Once they get into the cave, and then once they go through the cave, and then once things start to pop off after that, we end up having it to a reasonably, those are actually good moments. The in between those times to where we have to prepare for us to try to invest in these women, I am immediately just like, God, this is so boring. And really, we have it to where there are some characters that are kind of built up better within this movie. Uh, and so, recently, when I go into spoilers, I'm going to say that really, yeah, like the very beginning is boring, but I can understand certain scenes. I can understand what they're doing. They're kind of gearing us up to understand who these people are. And, like, yeah, it was boring to me, but that's probably just because, like, oh, like, maybe people are really into these certain kind of activities and teamwork and ba 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 ba. And so they're just like, yeah, like, this is a movie catered to me. Nice, good. I'm an adventurer, which is fine. Really, to me, I just, again, I thought the beginning was boring, but then also, like, also even in the beginning, I was like, okay, so this is kind of like, there's a lot of like quick quick events that happened within this game, or movie. I mean, I call it a game because I think honestly, The Descent would probably have been way better off as a actual video game than a movie. Like, here's the thing. One, You have an action movie, and I say action movie because there is a lot more going on in this film than a bunch of women who all decide to go into a cave. And so we end up having a ton of action sequences that you cannot actually see. If people will know, I have seen a movie that Ryan Reynolds had done called Buried. And you couldn't see anything that's going on into that film, but I would immediately say, well, that is 100% completely fine, because when looking at it, Ryan Reynolds is just in a coffin for the entire film, so you seeing every little bit of what he is doing does not matter. Whereas in this movie, it actually does matter. It actually does matter that you cannot see what is going on. So immediately I'm just like, well, man, this is like a really hard movie for me to invest in because I can't even see who is being killed off. I can't even see what is absolutely going on at every point in this movie, no matter what kind of camera lens or kind of thing that they try to try to adjust within this movie to say like, oh no, like you can actually see through parts of this film, parts of they should have come up with some easy adjustment for you to have seen a heck of a lot more going into these caves. Whether they had to come up with some kind of lighting of sorts to where you could see a heck of a lot more. Like, I just really just got very disinterested in this movie just because of, like, well, I can't see what's going on. What's going on? Another jump scare. Okay, like I figured that because it seems like they were really, really having way too close a moment in one area. Like here's the wind up, there's the pitch. Jump scare! Woo! I'm scared. No, I'm not. Really, a lot of people are like, dude, you were scared. Believe me, I know you were. No. Like, there was one actually legitimately scary moment, and that was it. But the only reason why that one tiny moment was actually scary for a mere second was just because that wasn't the wind up and pitch like approach of the other jump scares. That was actually scary. Like to me, like also the moment when we have like an Alien versus Predator, where we have the woman who's like, oh, like I'm resting easy, or the guy or the woman just resting easy, and they're like, oh man, like man, we just be able to just beat that, bro. We just did it. And then all of a sudden, you end up having like the alien who just like comes over her shoulder to just tell her hello and then just starts just attacking her and killing her. That moment, I was like, whoa, man, an Alien versus Predator. I thought that moment was scary. Whereas anything else was just kind of like, okay, here's the wind up and here's the pitch. Even the points where I would just start to see certain things just dropping out of the sky, let's just say, within this movie. Here's the thing. So I am also going to tee this movie up for people that want to know a little bit more about what this movie is entailing, because it's like, well, is it just going to be one of those adventure movies where people have to just really go into a horribly made cave? Like, is that all the film is? No. And plus, I have also kind of seen these kinds of movies where it's all of a sudden like somebody goes into a cave and then all of a sudden gets into a point where they've realized that there's something more here than they could handle, and that ends up being the entire film. And that's what this movie really is. We end up having a bunch of adrenaline junkies who all decide one day, hey, let's all go into a cave. And so we end up having these women who all decide to go into this cave to eventually realize that they are biting off more than they can chew, and that they end up also losing parts of their equipment, so that way they can make through this cave a lot quicker. And so we eventually have it to where we are to go on to eventually have these people who are to try to survive in the elements to try to get out of this cave. But that's not quite hard enough for them to eventually just make it through this cave. Eventually, we end up having, of course, what I would call a very Predator Blade 2 Esh like thing going on within this movie, where we eventually have some girl who is to eventually realize there's something in this cave. And then eventually we end up having an entire sequence where we have to figure out and investigate what is in this cave. And eventually we end up also having people who are to put on like night vision camera lenses and stuff like that to be able to see more that is going on to this cave. That it seems that people, numerous people, have come to this cave and eventually have come there to die, sadly enough. So, yeah, with that said, we could really say, are these people going to make it out alive? Are they all just going to get killed off? Are you going to like the ending of this movie? Maybe. Are you, like, I was kind of really expecting, like, again, like, when you have a wind up pitch jump scare like movie where it just, like, the jump scares feel prepared immediately, that's what just kind of takes me out of the film, where I'm just like, okay, this is like an actually like it's actually attempting to do the scary moments. Oh, okay. Like, you can kind of gear for certain kind of scary movie films, you can kind of easily gear up for them, because really it all depends on what kind of scary movie it is. It's like, if it's one of those where they try to like tickle you with music, kind of like gearing you into that mode of like giving you that adrenaline song where all of a sudden you're like, then it's like basically that's what that whole entire movie is going to be and is going to have to rest on, is just the adrenaline of the music to get you pumping. And I actually like that kind of thing where we eventually have the music that leads us up to the big scare thing, and then I'm like, whoa, that actually was actually a pretty decent scare. uh I think the stupid thing and the cheap thing to do is to do the dropping of books scare, or the cheap scares that I think that ends up within this movie at points in time, where I just immediately scoff at. I'm like, ah, cheap scares. The garbagey, cheap scares that I never like in any horror film, and I immediately just go like, nah, like what a poor quality this movie is. That's what I like. I don't care if it's like the most expensive horror movie that you've ever heard of in your life, and it does those little cheap, goofy, like, oh yeah, we're gonna just have a little like we're just gonna have some water all of a sudden just break through these rocks and scare somebody. Oh, cheap scare. But anyways, I don't know. I thought that this movie was interesting, but again, you have to buy into the beginning of this film, which you basically have to buy into some slumber party, which I'm like, sure. And then you eventually have to buy into the ending, which I was just kind of like, okay. Well, at least we seemingly had some Predator-ish like moments in this movie. At least, like I got some kind of moments where we end up having some of the women here really not actually seem completely defenseless, which I actually did enjoy. To where people were stepping up and were like, "Yeah, like I'm gonna take these things down. Like I'm gonna take a thing down. I'm gonna take that big." Monsterish whatever it is down. That's what I'm gonna do. Because I'm trying to make it vague as if it's one thing or many things, or it's maybe just small animals, or maybe it is just nothing. Maybe it's a ghost in the cave. Maybe, man, would they be effed if it was a ghost? Good God. But anything, yeah, like I I will probably never have any interest of ever actually seeing this movie again, but it was actually just kind of nice to watch this film. Just to be like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I could, like, easily prepare myself for this movie. And like they didn't really like you couldn't really see much of anything, so you really just couldn't have gotten like really just like, oh, the goriness of this movie, oh, it's horrible, because you can't see anything. You're just like, oh, well, I guess that person's dead now. Oh, well, that sucks. She looked pretty hot. Like that's what this movie was. Hot women who end up dying, sadly. Ah, that's basically what this entire movie was, sadly enough. So with that said, I spent way too much time talking about this in cryptic like sense. Let's get into spoiler sense of this movie. Really, there's not really even much to break down in much of spoiler sense because it kind of just gets to the point to where one, within this cave there is barely anything to actually see, but on top of that, really the breakdown of this movie, I hope and or think, is actually pretty easy. It's pretty simple. So I think it's about time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil. Pooh! This movie. To me, I would say I don't know whether or not to say that this movie is good or is bad. Like I think it just has this like silver lining thing where it's like it's not a good movie, but it's also not an awful one either. Um just the stuff that in between kind of doesn't do this movie overall any favors. So, with that said, let's go into it. So, we immediately have it to where it seems that we end up having this girl who is named Sarah, and she ends up having this thing called a husband. And she also has this thing called a kid, wouldn't you think? And so we end up having Sarah, who ends up going with her friends to go and do this white water rafting thing, which, like, to me, like, I was thinking, I'm like, well, that white water rafting thing is kind of short, but, like, man, were they really having fun. You could really tell that, like, they were really having fun, and then they looked really good doing it, because they were hot women doing cool stuff. The thing that I like about this movie is hot women doing cool stuff. That's the best part of this movie. But then again, like you could have probably had any number of wrong of any kind of woman eventually doing this movie, and still it would have been really just as equally awesome. Anyways, so moving on. So we end up having them doing their white water rafting thing, and everyone's high fiving, and they're like, "Yeah, let's never do that again, cause we won't, cause we're all gonna probably die at the end of this movie, so we're never gonna do that again." So we end up having them packing up after doing their seemingly very brief water rafting adventure, and so we end up having Sarah, who ends up going into the car with her husband, who is to be Paul, and they are to drive off. Here's the thing. So we end up having them drive off. There basically is no dialogue, narration, nothing between Sarah and her husband. And so we end up having all of a sudden this car just driving and driving itself into a car accident where all of a sudden we have all of these pipes that are shooting out of this other car to shoot into Paul, which is to basically just murder the man. And so we end up having Sarah, who is to end up waking up into the hospital to find out that not only Paul is this thing called dead, but also it seems that her daughter is also the dead as well. To where we end up having Sarah, who is running around in this hospital. She's like, where am I running to? Because where should my friends be? And so her friends end up coming to her and telling her, it's like, yeah, I'm just letting you know that, like, Paul, he's donezo. He's dead. Like, we buried him. And you were probably in a coma, I hope, because that would actually make a lot of sense. So, uh, boo-hoo for Sarah's husband, but it's moot point because we end up having it to where this is going to come back around in some part of this movie about the whole Sarah having a husband thing. So we end up having it to where Sarah is to eventually go with this group of gals to go and have a ladies' night to where they are all going to be together in a cabin and just drink till they can't drink anymore and then just talk about like how their lives are going. We end up having some of the girls that are just kind of really sad that they could not come to the funeral for Sarah because they're really heartbroken. Like there was some of these characters who couldn't make it because they were doing their midterms or college or something. And so we end up having, of course, one of these characters within this group like showcasing to us right away that this person is going to become a doctor. So it's like, okay, so we will have a doctor in this team. So we end up having showcased like who some of these girls are. Some of them are very adventurous. Some of them uh, really just don't care and they just do whatever with their life. And so we eventually have these people that are just like, okay, like investing in all this entire group is over. Let's get into this cave. So let's just shove all these girls in this cave, sadly. So we end up having and taking all these girls from this cabin to now this cave. And so we end up having these girls who are to eventually, slowly but surely, start going through this very tall or very small uh, section of this cave to where it seems that there isn't much room between their actual bodies and the hole of where the point of where they have to climb up into is. So we eventually end up finding out that it seems that one of the girls ends up actually getting stuck. Maybe because she farted and like the way that she moved, she just got stuck. So we end up having, I believe, Beth going back to try and unstuck one of the girls. And so when eventually this girl does pull her out, it seems that the cave is starting to very much start to collapse. And so we end up having Beth saying, like, let's freaking get out of here. I don't care about the rope bag. Like, this cave is gonna condense here. And so we end up having both these girls who are now scrambling to get out of where they are at because everything is starting to cave in. And so we end up having the girls who uh, are really giving us the where is the map moment from Blair Witch Project, where it's like, hey, like, do you guys have the map? Like, where is the map? Like, I'm sure Dave had the map, right? Dave, where's the map? Oh, the map's gone. I don't even know if the guy's actual name was Dave, but man, that guy, that douchebaggery guy that forgot where the map was. Oh, I swear, I should probably watch that movie because of how many times I complained about that moment because I thought it was so stupid how they had over and over complained to that guy about, yeah, you moron, I forgot the map. Who cares? So we end up finding out that their extra thing of rope is now gone, is now gonzo. And so now these women have to like use all of their equipment, I guess, fairly sparingly because they don't have much equipment now because there's a whole entire bag that is now gone. So we end up finding out that seemingly this group of people isn't going actually through a normal like a normal run of the mill like exercise cave or whatever. We end up having one of the girls ending up just deciding on a whim to just like, well, no, like, I wanted to go through this brand new cave that no one has ever heard of before because I wanted us to just plant our flag after this whole thing is over and name this cave and just say, like, yeah, we invented this cave, basically. And we end up having the girls going like, well, wait a minute, like, that is stupid because if anything, like, I thought we were going to go to so and so cave, and I told the people that were going to come to get us if there was any problems that we were going to be in this cave if anything happened. And so we end up having it to where the girl's like, well, sorry, my bad. So we have them having to forcibly push along. And so we, of course, end up having one of the girls trying to make it through or down into this cave. And so we end up having Holly, who is to eventually go down this portion of cave way too fast, and she ends up breaking her leg. To where we end up seeing a chunk of bone popping out of that leg. We're like, whoa, is she popping? And like, yeah, everybody's like popping it like she's hot. So we end up going along and having Holly say, come on down here because you guys need to freaking just put my bone back into my leg. Come on down, you're the next contestant on freaking Fix My Leg. So we end up having the rest of the girls all come down to her. She's like, hey, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, I think I broke my leg. Like, I can see the bone. I can see the poking white thing that has come out of my leg. And so we end up having Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, going in and having to tell Holly that she needs to reset this girl's leg to have the bone go back into this girl's leg before they can give her a brace. And then after that, this girl cannot put any weight on her leg, and ipso facto. So while we have it to where the doctor and all the girls are trying to help this girl try to fix her leg and put braces on it and all kinds of things, we end up having one girl who ends up kind of checking things out, kind of double checking to make sure she is able to see the things that she thinks that she is seeing. And so we end up having a girl go on to just kind of do some checking of thinking that there might be a hole somewhere in this cave to where maybe they can escape, because we end up having consistently where they are lighting a lighter to see where the flame is going, and where the flame is going, they think that they can go and eventually find a hole in this cave to eventually get out, because really the air, because really we have it to where like wind and stuff like that could tell you exactly like where eventually air is coming from or air is going to or whichever. So we end up having this one girl who's to poke her head out to just kind of look around into this cave while everybody is resetting Holly's leg. And so we end up having this girl who is to see something, like some kind of man, some kind of thing. And so we end up having this girl saying, hey guys, I saw a ugly looking thing. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it's a man that it's going to go out and help us. Because it seems that eventually while these people were going and trying to go from area to area, and we have them at some point in time having to do like these like hanging like moments to where they're like with their entire body they're like hanging with like one of their hands and like tossing another thing up to lock into place for them to be able to put a rope onto that one part, so that way they can just kind of dangle, and they have to kind of consistently keep doing that. And eventually we end up having at some point that while one girl is to go across, like cliffhanger like style, if you remember the very beginning of the movie Cliffhanger, where we end up having Michael Rooker, who is to just like use this pulley system to where he's like using ropes and getting from one part of a mountain to another. We end up having these girls trying to do this situation the same, and their equipment ends up, I guess, starting to break to where eventually this rope part ends up like falling to where we end up having one of the girls having to like scramble and like burn the out of this girl's hand to try and keep a hold of this girl so that way she doesn't fall forever or whichever. And so we end up having these girls pulling this girl up, and she luckily had survived to eventually die another day. So, anyways, we go along and we have to have this moment where they're doing this whole rope thing, not once but twice within this movie to get from parts of this cave. So, we eventually have it to where these people are to go along here. And so here are the jump scares as they are to follow. So when Sarah is to eventually be uh, in her room sleeping, she eventually is to, I guess, wake up and eventually look out her window to get a pipe in her face to kill her. I'm like, here's the wind up, and there's the pipe. She is dead, to only wake up realizing that she is dreaming. And then the next, here's the wind up and the pitch. We end up having a part of this cave that seems to be having a camera on it for far too long. And surefire enough, we end up having the girls going like, do 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 do. I'm walking through a cave like a moron. And so we end up having just a ton of bats just all attacking this girl, not actually attacking, but just saying like, "Hey, we're bats and we're here. Isn't that perfect?" And so we end up having that other jump scare, and we end up having also this girl who is to go on to look at this one like piece of scenery for a while, and we end up just having a rock falling out of nowhere. What a garbage thing to do there. But I was like, immediately, I'm like, something's going to fall here. And it's not going to be the monster this time around. It has to be something else. So we end up finding out that this monstrous thing is none other than a Blade 2 knockoff of a vampire-esque like character. A person that ends up repetitively trying to jump on the back of people and bite them on the neck to get a little sweet, delicious nibble of probably their blood. Because we end up finding out when the doctor, after they end up killing one of these things, they end up finding out that it's like, well, like this thing acts just like a bat of sorts. And so, like, it must be going off of sound instead of, so it's like, it's just like a bat where it goes off of sonar rather than actual visually seeing something. And so we end up getting prepared to have these people really starting to, at first, once everything starts to pop off, because we end up having eventually these girls like walking through these caves, and eventually they walk right into one of these things, one of these monsters, and eventually these things keep dropping from the ceiling, or they kind of like hang from the ceiling and attack one of these girls. And so eventually we end up having people starting to just run like crazy. And of course, the weakest characters, of course, pretty much easily get killed in the end because really that is supposed to happen anyways. So we end up having it to where it seems that we end up having most of these girls ending up getting jumped and end up getting killed. And then we end up having Juno, who is to eventually take it upon herself to actually start to put up a pretty decent defense between these things. And she is taking her axe, little rock axe thing that she has, and she is swinging at these things and she is killing them. like Blade or anyone else who has gone before her. But we still have these like Predator moments where eventually we are starting to have people starting to realize that if they don't move, they will not get killed. And so we end up having one girl who ends up just having a night vision camera out and is watching everything that these monsters are doing, but she's trying not as much as humanly possible to say one word. When the monster gets much more and more closer to her, we end up having this girl who is trying to even like pop her head back so that way this girl won't even breathe on this monster, so this monster would attack her because of just a breath. And so we eventually start to see that these girls are tossing at some points or another some greenish looking neon like lights at some points, so that way we can actually have good lighting in 5 to 10 seconds of some scenes here. But recently, a bulk of these scenes are in complete darkness, I guess, to cover up any mistake that they would probably make, or reasonably also to just kind of cover up the fact that, like, well, obviously, like, these attacks are done so that way it's to protect the actors and whichever you could probably if there was actually real lighting going on into this environment, we would just be like, man, that is like 20 feet away from this monster, and like good on camera angles, good on this for making it look good, but actually you could easily tell that like kind of the way that they cut all this, where it's just kind of like, okay, like these people were probably like a good distance away from attacking any of these monsters, or really everything had to be prepped to just be like, okay, so and so actor like realize that this thing is gonna jump on top of you. So make it look like you're trying to squirm and whichever. We end up having some girls, I think, almost kind of doing almost MMA style moves of trying to get these things to stop attacking them, to where they kind of like they rear arm naked choke hold. Like some of these monsters end up like rear naked choke holding some of these women, and we end up having, I think, Juno, who ends up kind of rolling away from this and eventually turning her chest to this monster's chest and trying to attack it via any other means. So we eventually go on and accidentally have Juno, who ends up taking her axe and shoving it into Beth's neck, which ends up killing one of her own friends. And so we end up having Beth, who ends up grabbing onto a necklace of uh, Juno to realize that Juno had some connection to Sarah's husband, it seems. It seems that Juno had an affair with Paul, because it seems that uh, really we could have had it to where Juno had mentioned that, yeah, Sarah did lose quite a bit from that car accident, but so did we all. To where really Juno can just gripe with the fact of like, well, yeah, like I lost my husband too that day, or I lost my man that too, because he was having an affair with me, or whatever. Because there was a lot of stuff that was kind of just unsaid, or there was a lot of stuff that was just like, man, if they could have just done this one little scene to just make people just realize, oh, so like, oh, okay, I can understand now why like they had to showcase this scene to just help us. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you, I guess, have to just like figure out just by one little nugget here and there. So we end up having Beth, who is now to have knife in her throat, and we end up just having Juno, who's like, well, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave you. Goodbye. To where Juno is just laying there, just realizing, dude, I'm gonna die soon. And so we end up having everybody who is just kind of gung ho out for themselves. And so we end up having two women uh, that are just kind of like hiding it out, not trying to make any noise so that way they don't get detected. We end up having Juno, who is axing everything that moves, even if it's an actual human. And so we end up having Sarah, who eventually is to start to come with eventually the rest of this group to kind of ask who all is dead so far, to where Juno knows exactly how many people are dead. Like they're consistently doing a bizarrish body count to confirm to us who's still alive and who is dead, even though I can't know who is who at this point because I didn't get to know exactly who everyone's name was before we even got to this cave. So, and plus everything that was going on was complete pitch black dark for most of the movie, so how could I have known any number of things? So, going on in this movie, we end up having people that are like, just like, dude, I'm gonna carry on. I don't care about you people. Like, I'm gonna try to find my way out of here. And really, we end up having that, those two people just being led to eventually just being killed off, being devoured by these monsters, and getting brutally killed. To where we end up having Juno, who is to just kind of back up. We end up having Sarah, who ends up going all the way back to confirm every dead body, and she ends up like starting to pull out her Arnold Schwarzenegger from Predator movie moment, where we end up having Sarah, who ends up just kind of slowly but surely kind of blending into her environment so these monsters won't eventually see her. Because eventually we end up seeing that Juno is to realize that eventually they are getting outnumbered and surrounded, and so yeah, people are going to end up dead. So we end up having it to where uh, Sarah is to go back for Beth. And so we end up having it to where Beth is giving Sarah the little thing that she took from Juno to have Sarah realize that her husband was cheating on her with this woman. And so we end up having also, of course, Sarah mention how Paul had this like little saying that he would always say, to where eventually we end up having Sarah, who ends up pulling over the little bracelet thing, and of course I believe that that saying was actually carved into this thing for Sarah to realize that, oh my God, my husband was cheating on me, having a secret affair with this woman, and I didn't even know. So we ended up having Sarah, who is just like an utter just, oh my God, how could this have happened? How could like this get to this point to where I've lost pretty much everything at this point? And we end up having Beth telling Sarah that she cannot trust Juno. And immediately I'm like, well, like, that's because she's named after a movie of a pregnant lady that got knocked up, and like a teen, a young teen that ended up getting knocked up. The girl that was uh, Elliot Page. Yeah, Elliot Page. So going on into this movie, so we end up having Beth telling Sarah, it's like, well, you can't leave me like this. I'm going to die soon, but I want you to just make it even much more horrific by just bashing my head in with a rock, if you don't mind. So Sarah just was like, okay, that sounds like a nifty idea. So Sarah ends up grabbing a rock and just bashing in Beth's skull and brutally killing her. And so we end up having Sarah making her way back to this person called Juno, because we end up having both Sarah and Juno who are to have to put up a defense. So we end up having Juno looking at Sarah, and she's like, wow, you have become very battle hardened in this whole situation. Where, yeah, like, Sarah is like head to toe, like, covered in blood. And she's just like, you know what? Like, I'm really just like pulling off the Arnold Schwarzenegger moment where I'm just kind of like letting all these monsters kind of like just start walking over on me. but I'm going to get the best out of them eventually because I'm going to go and just murder them. So we end up having Sarah, who ends up all of a sudden just Rambo-ishing her way through this, to where we end up having Juno and Sarah kind of back to back. And so we end up having Sarah, who just kind of single handedly takes out a ton of these monsters by herself. And so we end up seeing that there seems to be some way out coming soon to caves near you. And so we end up having it to where after Sarah takes out all these monsters, and it seems that we're back to just Juno and Sarah just having their one on one time. We end up having Sarah taking a big, huge uh, axe choppity to Juno's leg, to where Juno ends up falling over, and Sarah's like, okay, well, I'm leaving you. Deuces! And so Sarah ends up going further on to this cave to notice that there is eventually a light at the end of this tunnel. She's scrambling up these things of bones to make her way out of this cave to eventually make it back to her car to scramble to get just to be away from this place. So we end up having Sarah, who is like, oh my god, yeah, I made it. But I'm bizarrely, I guess with her car she ran out of gas, I guess, because she ends up just getting out of her car, but then getting back into her car, and then bizarrely there is some weird looking ghost that appears. And so we end up realizing that Sarah is back into the cave, and to where we are just supposed to suspect now that there is no way out, that there is no way for Sarah to win this. And so we end up having Sarah, who ends up having a psychological just breaking, snapping, whatever. And so we bizarrely end up having Sarah, instead of trying to make her way out of this cave, we end up having Sarah, who ends up bizarrely deciding to have a birthday cake with her daughter in this cave. And that is where we are to leave off with this movie, to just basically say, well, everyone is going to die in this cave. Sarah is realizing that, so she is trying to make the best out of a horrible situation, realizing she is going to die anyways. So she is just going to have one fun moment of memory for her to replay over and over in her head, where all of this horrible carnagey stuff is all going on within this film, to where eventually we end up just having Sarah realizing that there's no way out, that she might as well just make the best of this by just jogging in her brain some memory of a time where she was happy, because she's going to die. And then we have the credits roll, the movie ends, and I'm like, man, like, so we didn't have a happy ending, but we just had an ending where a woman was just in a cave, and like we could maybe have a sequel to where like Sarah comes back and she's like, hey, like I've been in this cave for I don't know how long killing all these monsters, and I'm sane now. So I'm here for cave people number 2, and like I'm just gonna help you guys out. Uh, or we could go the opposite route and have a human who is banding themselves to the vampire-ish like monsters, and we could go any number of routes. So with that said, yeah, like that's just the way the movie ends. Again, really up until the car accident, I thought the movie was just kind of like, come on, let's do something. And then also the girls get together was just kind of like, could you get somewhere? Like really, I don't think we really got anywhere until like the first hour of this movie was over, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, like let's get this popping off. All right, this is pretty awesome. And then so eventually, like I wasn't thinking that this movie was going to have a happy ending. And then when they kind of tease you with the happy ending, you're just like, oh, she made it out. Like, I was thinking everyone was going to die. And immediately that's where eventually we ended up heading anyway. So just like, oh, you basically got teased with the happy ending to just realize no, everyone is going to die in the end because Sarah just loses her effing mind and just is staying in this cave because she doesn't know any better. So yeah, reasonably, kind of a very interesting cave movie, but then again, my grievances are just the fact of like it's an action sequence movie that you can't see what's going on. So I thought that that was stupid. I thought like this movie at some points was a waste of time just because you can't do an action sequence where you can see nothing. Like if it was a Ryan Reynolds stuck in a coffin movie, I could say, oh, okay, the dark moments are perfectly okay. For this movie, no. You need to see a lot more of what's going on within this film. I thought it was just dumb, and I thought it was just like, oh, okay, well, this movie was cheap, and more than likely it was probably a Warner's Brother movie, right? Because it has that kind of like it kind of has that approach to it. It kind of feels like a Warner Brothers movie to me, to where it's like, oh, well, hey, like we can't do special effects very well, or we can't do fight scenes very well, so let's just put all our characters in pitch black darkness so you can't see what's going on. And I get it; it's hard to get lighting into a cave, and I think it. A lot of people would just say it's like, well, yeah, like it would be dumb to have a cave heavily lit up. That seems dumb. I'm like, well, yeah, but you could have had any number of people that have probably come through this cave because they said that in the movie that there was at points in time where you could tell someone had come there before. And hence why you could have had this location kind of having equipment or something like that from previous people. Because eventually there needs to have been like sacks and whatever of just previous people that have left things along the way and probably died along the way as well to get people who are to be ramped up for this scenario, what is to come to eventually people are to eventually get killed off. And eventually they end up finding the bones, and then that's what ends up kind of ramping up the, oh, hey, we're going to die here kind of thing. But, anyways, I wanted to get out of here so I don't take too much time with this review. I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.